The mop hit the floor with a hollow clatter that echoed through the empty hangar at exactly 2300 hours. Marcus Hale stood motionless in the dim fluorescent light, staring at the yellow maintenance bucket that had been his constant companion for the past 14 months. His hands were raw from industrial cleaner, his back ached from reaching under aircraft bellies, and his phone displayed a voicemail from his daughter's school about unpaid lunch fees that he'd ignored for the third time that week. The security badge clipped to his coveralls read, Contractor Ground Services, but the faded leather jacket hanging in his locker upstairs bore wings and a patch that once meant something. He'd scrubbed oil stains from concrete where F-16s had leaked hydraulic fluid, swept debris from taxiways where pilots he'd once led into combat now taxied past without recognition, and accepted the invisible status that came with failure. The official report had been clinical in its assessment. Pilot error during a routine training exercise. Aircraft recovered, no casualties, but judgment questioned. His wings had been a formality after that, surrendered in a manila envelope to a colonel who wouldn't meet his eyes. The real punishment wasn't the paperwork. It was watching Lieutenant Chen brief missions Marcus had designed, seeing Captain Rodriguez lead formations Marcus had perfected, and knowing that his 12-year-old daughter Sophia believed her father cleaned toilets because he wanted to. She didn't know about the Silver Star in the storage unit, didn't know about Kandahar or the 73 close air support missions that had brought soldiers home. She knew algebra homework and frozen dinners and the careful way her father avoided talking about the past. The facility supervisor had called him into the office at 22:30 with apologetic eyes and budget reports. Nothing personal, Marcus. Federal contract restructuring. Last hired, first released. The handshake had been firm, the severance envelope thin, and the walk back to his mop bucket had felt longer than any combat ingress he'd ever flown. Marcus pushed the bucket toward the storage closet with his boot, moving through muscle memory while his mind calculated rent and grocery costs, and the exact moment when dignity would require choosing between electricity and Sophia's antibiotics. The hangar smelled like jet fuel and industrial solvent, a combination that used to mean purpose and now just meant another job he'd lost. He'd already drafted the explanation in his head. Something about new opportunities and fresh starts, delivered with the same false confidence he used when explaining why they ate spaghetti 4 nights a week. Outside, 3 sets of rotor blades cut through the midnight silence with a sound that made Marcus freeze mid-step. Not the regular rhythm of medevac birds or the heavy thunder of cargo helicopters. These were Black Hawks, flying low and fast, their navigation lights strobing against the desert darkness as they banked hard toward the civilian section of the airfield where contractors parked. Marcus told himself it was coincidence. Told himself to finish his shift, collect his final paycheck, and disappear into the civilian job market where former fighter pilots became insurance adjusters or flight instructors for teenagers who'd never understand what real flying meant. But the Black Hawks weren't headed to the military ramp. They were descending toward the contractor parking lot, their downwash kicking up dust devils that swirled through the fence line, and Marcus felt something cold settle into his chest that had nothing to do with the night air. He left the mop bucket where it stood and walked toward the side exit with deliberate steps, telling himself he was just curious, knowing it was a lie. The first helicopter touched down between a Honda Civic and a rusted pickup truck, its skids hitting pavement with a shriek of metal that sent car alarms wailing across the lot. The second landed 30 feet away, rotor wash shattering a windshield and sending loose papers spiraling into the darkness. The third hovered above them both, its spotlight sweeping across the building until it locked onto the side door where Marcus stood frozen with his hand on the exit bar. A figure jumped from the first Black Hawk before its skids had fully settled, combat boots hitting concrete at a run. Full flight suit, survival vest, helmet under one arm and a tablet computer clutched in the other hand like a weapon. The rank insignia caught the parking lot lights as the figure sprinted toward him. Colonel. The helicopter's crew chief was already waving frantically, and the rotor pitch increased with the urgent whine of aircraft preparing for immediate departure. Marcus pushed through the door and stepped into the rotor wash, squinting against the debris storm while every instinct from his previous life screamed contradictions. "Stand down, you're a civilian now. Report for duty, a colonel doesn't run for janitors." The figure reached him, and Marcus saw recognition flash across weathered features beneath sweat and exhaust stains. Colonel Patricia Voss. She'd been a major when Marcus left, a career tactical officer who'd survived 3 deployments by being smarter than everyone else in the air and twice as mean on the ground. "Hail." Her voice cut through the rotor noise like a mission brief. "How fast can you get back into a cockpit?" Marcus stared at her while his brain processed impossibilities. He wasn't rated anymore. Hadn't touched a stick in 14 months. Had a daughter who needed him to be stable and bills that required him to be employed, and a life that had moved past the part where colonels arrived at midnight with desperate questions. "I don't fly anymore, ma'am." The words tasted like ash. Voss grabbed his arm with a grip that brought back briefing rooms and combat launches. 43 minutes ago, 6 F-16s crossed into hostile airspace north of the demarcation zone. Electronic warfare swept the entire sector blind 30 seconds later. Ground stations lost contact. Satellite coverage shows massive surface-to-air activity, but we can't identify friend or hostile. Command needs someone who can read an air battle without instruments, who knows those pilots personally, and who can coordinate rescue operations in communications blackout. Her eyes held something Marcus hadn't seen directed at him in over a year. Need. Every rated pilot we have is either in the air already or positioned at forward bases we can't risk pulling from. The situation is deteriorating faster than command can respond, and we've got 6 aircraft and 12 souls in contested space with no one on the ground who understands what they're seeing. Marcus felt the foundation of his carefully constructed civilian life crack like overstressed metal. "Why me? I'm discharged. I'm not current. I haven't even sat in a simulator since you put a damaged F-16 down in a sandstorm with both hydraulic systems failed and talked 3 other pilots through the same storm using only UHF radio." Voss's voice was flat, reciting facts. "Since you coordinated the rescue of 73 Marines using nothing but visual navigation and a broken compass. Since you proved that when everything fails, you don't." The second Black Hawk's engine screamed louder, and Marcus saw movement in its crew compartment. Someone in a flight suit was setting up mobile command equipment, running cables and pulling up digital displays that glowed green in the darkness. They were already building the operations center, already assuming his answer. "I have a daughter," Marcus said quietly. "I know." Voss released his arm but didn't step back. "She's with your sister-in-law." Federal Protective Services contacted her 20 minutes ago with a cover story about a training recall. She thinks you're helping with a scheduled exercise. "This conversation isn't happening officially, Hale. You were never discharged in our records. You were transferred to reserve status pending psychological evaluation that somehow never got completed. Paperwork error. Bureaucratic oversight. Whatever story makes you feel better about what I'm asking you to do." Marcus looked past her at the Black Hawks, at the crew chiefs watching with professional patience, at the tactical display being assembled in the second helicopter's crew bay. 6 aircraft, 12 pilots, probably people he'd trained, flown with, trusted with his life in previous wars. Now trapped in contested airspace while command scrambled for answers, and he stood in a parking lot wearing janitor's coveralls, and trying to remember why he'd convinced himself that a normal life was worth more than this. "What's the tactical situation?" His voice shifted registers without permission, dropping into the clipped tone of mission briefings. Voss's expression didn't change, but something in her posture relaxed fractionally. "Contested zone 40 miles north of the demarcation line. 6 F-16s were running combat air patrol when ground radar picked up unidentified aircraft crossing from hostile territory. Our birds moved to intercept. Then every electronic system in a 50-mile radius went dark. Satellite shows massive SAM activity, but we can't establish communication with anyone inside the affected zone. No radio, no data link, nothing. Marcus's mind was already building the three-dimensional picture, plotting vectors and angles, and the 100 ways an engagement could deteriorate when communications failed. How long ago? 38 minutes from initial contact to total blackout. We've got an E3 sentry trying to re-establish link from outside the jamming envelope, but it's getting interference from something we haven't seen before. Command believes it's a new electronic warfare system, but belief doesn't help the pilots who are flying blind. The wind from the rotors pulled at Marcus's coveralls, and he became suddenly, painfully aware of how far he'd fallen from the person Voss was asking him to become again. I can't just climb into a cockpit and fly combat air patrol. I'm not current on anything. I'd be a liability. Voss pulled a tablet from her vest and thrust it toward him. The screen showed 6 blue diamonds in loose formation, frozen in their last known positions before the blackout. I'm not asking you to fly. I'm asking you to read the battle. We've got pilots who can follow orders and controllers who can coordinate from outside the zone. What we don't have is someone who can look at fragments of information and understand what's actually happening when the technology fails. Marcus took the tablet with hands that remembered how to hold tactical displays even after 14 months of holding mops. The blue diamonds were positioned in a defensive wheel, the kind of formation you used when expecting threats from multiple vectors. Whoever was leading that patrol had anticipated trouble. Whose flight lead? Captain Rodriguez. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. He'd trained Rodriguez. Had spent 6 months in pre-deployment workup teaching her how to read air combat the way some people read poetry. She thought in 3 dimensions and flew like gravity was a suggestion, and if she'd set up a defensive wheel before the blackout, she'd expected the fight to come from everywhere at once. Show me the SAM activity. Voss swiped the screen, and the display changed to infrared satellite imagery. Bright blooms dotted the landscape in patterns that made Marcus's trained eye narrow. Those aren't defensive launches. That's a kill box. Someone's trying to herd them. Toward what? That's what we need you to figure out. The third Black Hawk descended another 10 feet, its spotlight tracking Marcus like a targeting laser. The pilot was wearing night vision goggles and watching him with the patience of someone who'd learned to wait through worse situations. Marcus looked at the tablet, then at Voss, then at the janitor's bucket still visible through the hangar door behind him. 14 months ago, he'd made a choice. Played it safe in a training scenario when aggression might have been correct. Second-guessed himself at exactly the wrong moment and turned a routine exercise into a reviewed incident that ended his career. The official finding was pilot error, but the real error had been losing the confidence to trust his instincts when nothing else made sense. He'd spent 14 months convincing himself that doubt was wisdom, that civilian life was recovery, that being a father meant choosing safety over the parts of himself that had thrived in chaos. Sophia's face flashed through his mind. Algebra homework and frozen dinners and the careful way she never asked about the metals in storage. Then Rodriguez's face. 28 years old and brilliant in the air, probably leading 5 other pilots through a nightmare while command sat paralyzed by electronic darkness and missing information. If I do this, Marcus said slowly, I need direct communication with whoever is running the rescue coordination. No chain of command delays. No command by committee. I see something, I speak, and people move. Voss's expression didn't change. You'll have direct line to the Joint Operations Center and override authority on anything related to those 6 aircraft. You see a problem, you fix it. You need assets, you take them. This is off-book enough that normal protocol stopped applying the moment I climbed into that helicopter. Marcus handed back the tablet and looked down at his coveralls, at the name tag that said contractor instead of captain, at the hands that smelled like industrial cleaner instead of jet fuel. Then he walked back into the hangar, past the abandoned mop bucket, straight to the storage locker where his leather jacket hung on a hook beneath 14 months of dust. The wings were tarnished but intact. The call sign stitched beneath them was faded but still legible. Compass. They'd given him the name after the Sandstorm mission. When instruments failed and navigation died, and 3 other pilots had followed his voice through zero visibility using nothing but trust and UHF radio, someone had decided that Marcus Hale was the kind of pilot who could find direction when everything else pointed wrong. He'd worn the name like armor until the day he doubted himself in a training scenario and discovered that even compasses could fail when they stopped trusting their own magnetic north. Marcus pulled the jacket on over his coveralls and walked back into the rotor wash. Voss was already moving toward the first Black Hawk, speaking rapidly into a radio handset while crew chiefs prepared for immediate departure. The tablet was waiting for him in the crew bay of the second helicopter, mounted above a tactical display that was already pulling satellite data and fragmentary radar returns from the edge of the jamming zone. Marcus climbed aboard and strapped into the observer seat while the crew chief handed him a headset and pointed to the communication panel. Direct line to JOC is Channel 3. E3 Sentry is Channel 5. Ground Rescue Coordination is Channel 7. Colonel Voss gave you override authority on all frequencies. The Black Hawk lifted off before Marcus had finished adjusting his headset, and the world tilted into the familiar geometry of tactical aviation. Below them, the airfield shrank into a grid of lights and runways. Ahead, the desert stretched into darkness that hid whatever was happening to 6 pilots who'd flown into an electronic void. The crew chief leaned close and shouted over the engine noise. Colonel said you were the best reader she'd ever flown with. Said you could look at a furball and know who would win before the missiles flew. Marcus didn't answer. He was staring at the tactical display, watching it process information from satellites and radar stations outside the jamming zone, building a picture of nothing useful. 6 blue diamonds frozen in their last known positions. No updates, no telemetry, no indication of whether those pilots were evading, engaging, or already scattered across the desert in burning wreckage. Just silence and the static hiss of dead frequencies where voices should have been calling targets and checking 6 and confirming kills. Marcus switched to Channel 3 and keyed the microphone. JOC, this is Compass. I'm airborne and reviewing tactical data. Give me everything you have from the last known contact before the blackout. The response came immediately, crisp and professional. Compass, JOC. Last contact was 39 minutes ago. 6 aircraft in defensive patrol wheel, altitude Angels 22, spacing 5 miles. Lead reported unidentified aircraft inbound from north at Angels 15. Electronic warfare warning activated 12 seconds later. Total communication loss at 41 seconds after initial contact. Satellite shows multiple surface-to-air launches beginning at 43 seconds. Current count is 18 separate launch signatures across a 20-mile front. Marcus pulled up the infrared overlay and studied the launch patterns while the Black Hawk carved through midnight air toward a destination he hadn't yet been told. 18 launches wasn't suppression fire, wasn't even aggressive defense. That was a coordinated kill box, timed and positioned to force aircraft into specific vectors where something else was waiting. What's north of the engagement zone? Hostile airspace with suspected advanced SAM systems. No confirmed intelligence on capabilities, but assessment is multiple long-range threats with over-the-horizon targeting. And south? Demarcation zone. Open desert for 30 miles, then friendly territory. Marcus traced the SAM launch positions with one finger on the screen, seeing the pattern emerge like a puzzle solving itself. The launches weren't random. They were creating a wall, pushing aircraft away from the border and deeper into contested space, herding them north toward something the satellites couldn't see. JOC, what assets do we have for immediate response? 2 rescue packages standing by at forward operating bases, 6 additional F-16s at alert status, E3 Sentry maintaining orbit at the edge of the jamming envelope, ground teams pre-positioned but unable to cross the demarcation line without authorization. Who authorizes? That would be you, Compass. Colonel Voss transferred tactical command 20 minutes ago. everything related to recovering those 6 aircraft runs through your position. Marcus felt the weight settle onto his shoulders like a flight suit he'd forgotten he owned. Command meant responsibility, meant making calls that would be reviewed and analyzed and potentially second-guessed for years afterward. It was the kind of pressure that had crushed him once before, turning a routine training scenario into a career-ending incident because he doubted himself at exactly the wrong moment. The Black Hawk banked hard and Marcus saw lights ahead that resolved into a small forward operating base carved out of the desert. Temporary structures surrounded by berms and vehicle revetments, the kind of place that existed solely to launch rescue operations and coordinate tactical responses in hostile territory. They were setting down before he'd finished processing the tactical picture, and Voss was already out of the first helicopter, striding toward a command tent with the determined pace of someone who'd run out of time for doubt. Marcus unbuckled and followed, his boots hitting sand that was still warm from the day's heat. Inside the tent, 3 large displays showed satellite feeds, radar returns, and communication status boards that were mostly empty except for red warning indicators. A dozen personnel manned stations with professional intensity, their faces lit by screen glow and their voices maintaining the careful calm of people managing a deteriorating situation. Voss pointed to the center display. "Compass, this is your operational theater. Anything you need, anyone you need to talk to, any asset you need to move, you have authority. I'll be coordinating with higher command and keeping the political complications away from your decisions. You focus on getting those pilots home." Marcus stepped up to the display, and the room's energy shifted subtly. People glanced at him with expressions that mixed curiosity and skepticism. He was wearing a leather jacket over Janitor's coveralls and hadn't flown operationally in over a year. He looked like someone's questionable uncle, not a tactical coordinator with override authority. "Show me real-time satellite," Marcus said quietly. The display shifted, and the engagement zone appeared in infrared detail. Heat signatures from the SAM launches were already fading, but their positions formed a clear pattern. A barrier running east to west, exactly where aircraft would need to cross to reach friendly airspace. "Zoom out. Show me 50 miles in all directions." The view expanded and Marcus saw what the tactical reports hadn't captured. The SAM sites weren't just blocking escape routes south. They were positioned to create a corridor, funneling aircraft northeast toward terrain that showed up as darker patches on infrared. Mountainous region with valleys and canyons, perfect for ambush tactics and impossible for satellite surveillance to penetrate effectively. "What's the geography northeast of the engagement zone?" An analyst keyed up terrain maps. "Mountainous border region, multiple valleys, limited radar coverage, known to have mobile SAM systems. Intelligence assesses it as high-risk penetration." Marcus studied the map while his mind built the tactical picture. Rodriguez was smart, too smart to fly into an obvious trap. If she'd been pushed northeast, she'd done it because every other option was worse, which meant the real threat wasn't the SAMs everyone could see. It was whatever was waiting in those mountains that the satellites couldn't detect. "Get me the E3 sentry on secure frequency." The communications officer punched buttons and handed Marcus a headset. "Sentry 07, this is Compass. I need your best guess on what's jamming communications inside the engagement zone." The response came back through layers of static. "Compass, Sentry 07. Jamming signature is consistent with advanced electronic attack systems, but the coverage pattern is unusual. It's not blanket suppression. It's selective. We're seeing intermittent breaks in the jamming that suggests someone is deliberately maintaining communication blackout only in specific areas." Marcus absorbed that while staring at the tactical display. Selective jamming meant intelligence, meant someone was controlling the electronic warfare environment and choosing what signals lived and died. "Can you punch through the jamming with high-power transmission?" "Negative. We've tried multiple frequencies and power levels. Whatever is generating the jamming is adaptive. It counters our attempts in real time." "What about the intermittent breaks? Are they predictable?" "Negative. They appear random, but they're too consistent to be actual system failure. Assessment is that someone is deliberately creating brief windows, possibly to monitor our response or to maintain their own communications. Marcus looked at Voss. They're watching us. Whoever set this up isn't just trying to shoot down our aircraft. They're studying how we respond. Voss's expression was grim. To what end? To understand our capabilities. Electronic warfare this sophisticated doesn't happen by accident. Someone invested serious resources into creating a scenario where they could observe our pilots under stress with our command structure effectively paralyzed. The room had gone quiet. People were listening now, not with skepticism, but with the focused attention of professionals recognizing expertise. Marcus turned back to the display and pointed at the northeast vector. Those mountains are where Rodriguez is taking her flight. She knows she can't go south past the SAM wall, can't stay in open airspace where she's exposed, so she's using terrain masking, fighting smart instead of hard. If she's in the mountains, we can't support her, the analyst said. Satellite coverage is intermittent, ground radar can't penetrate the valleys, and we have no communication, which means we adapt. Marcus pulled up the mission planning interface and started plotting vectors. His hands moved with muscle memory that 14 months of cleaning floors hadn't erased, building a tactical picture that existed more in his head than on the screen. I need two things immediately. First, get me the personnel files for all 6 pilots in that patrol. I need to know who's flying with Rodriguez and what their training background is. Second, I need authorization to cross the demarcation line with rescue assets. Voss stepped forward. The rescue authorization requires political clearance. That takes time. Then start the process now, because those pilots are going to need pickup the moment they break free of whatever is hunting them. And I won't have rescue birds sitting on the wrong side of a line on a map when that happens. Voss held his gaze for 3 seconds, then nodded and pulled out her radio. Marcus turned back to the display while the room erupted into controlled activity. People were moving with purpose now, making calls and pulling up databases and coordinating asset movements, because someone had finally given them direction that sounded like it came from experience rather than doctrine. The analyst brought up the pilot files and Marcus scanned them with growing understanding. Rodriguez was flight lead. Her wingman was Lieutenant Kessler, a young pilot with barely 2 years of operational experience but strong marks in formation flying. 3 and 4 positions were Captain Lee and Lieutenant Morrison, both solid mid-career pilots with combat experience. 5 and 6 positions were First Lieutenant Patel and Captain Zhao, the latter being an exchange pilot from an allied nation with advanced training in electronic warfare countermeasures. They've got a balanced flight, Marcus said to no one in particular. Rodriguez chose her people carefully, experience mixed with adaptability, and Zhao gives them someone who understands how to operate when the electrons stop working. Does it matter? The analyst asked. They're still trapped in a jamming envelope with no support and hostile forces converging. Marcus looked at the frozen blue diamonds on the display, remembering the sandstorm mission that had earned him his call sign. When instruments failed and navigation died, and 3 pilots had followed his voice through zero visibility using nothing but trust and determination. Rodriguez had been in pre-deployment training then, watching from the ground while Marcus talked her future squadron mates through conditions that should have killed them all. She'd asked him afterward how he'd stayed calm when everything was falling apart. Marcus had told her the truth. When nothing works, you work anyway. It matters, Marcus said quietly, because Rodriguez learned from the best pilots I ever flew with. She knows how to fight without technology. The question is whether we're smart enough to help her do it. The tense ambient sound had shifted. People were leaning forward, watching him with the kind of attention that came from recognizing someone who'd been exactly where they needed him to be before. Marcus switched frequencies and keyed the microphone with a prayer to physics and a hope that selective jamming meant occasional opportunity. Any aircraft operating in contested airspace north of demarcation line, this is compass on guard frequency. If you can hear this transmission, Transmit any tone on UHF guard for 3 seconds. Static hissed back at him. He waited 30 seconds and tried again. Any aircraft operating in contested airspace north of demarcation line, this is compass on guard frequency. Key your microphone twice if you can hear this transmission but cannot respond verbally. More static. The communications officer was shaking her head. The jamming is too effective. Even if they hear you, they can't respond through it. Keep the channel open and monitor for any signal variance. If that jamming is selective like the sentry thinks, there will be moments when something gets through. I need to know the instant it happens, even if it's just a carrier wave or a microphone click. The officer nodded and adjusted her equipment while Marcus returned his attention to the tactical display. The satellite imagery updated every 90 seconds, showing heat signatures and movement patterns that told stories in fragments. The SAM launches had stopped, which meant the initial barrier was complete. No new threats appearing, no additional complications beyond the ones already in play, which was exactly wrong. When you set an ambush, you didn't stop applying pressure until your target was destroyed or escaped, unless the ambush wasn't about destruction. Pull up the historical movement patterns for hostile aircraft in this region, Marcus ordered. I want to see the last 6 months of activity near these mountains. The analyst worked quickly, and a new overlay appeared. Red traces showed where hostile aircraft had operated, creating a picture of patrol patterns and training routes that clustered around specific areas. One valley in particular showed heavy activity, deep in the mountainous terrain where Rodriguez was being herded. What's in that valley? Marcus pointed at the cluster. Unknown. Satellite surveillance hasn't detected permanent structures, but the activity level suggests something significant. Intelligence has it flagged for future reconnaissance. They're protecting something. Marcus traced the patrol patterns with one finger. All this activity, all these resources dedicated to creating an electronic warfare trap there, not trying to shoot down our aircraft. They're trying to push them into that valley so they can capture them intact. The room went silent. Voss stepped closer to the display. That's a significant intelligence assessment based on movement patterns. It's the only assessment that makes sense. Marcus pulled up the SAM launch positions again. Look at the spacing. Look at the timing. Every launch was designed to threaten without achieving kill probability. They're herding cattle, not hunting wolves. They want our pilots alive and our aircraft recoverable so they can study both. If you're right, then this is a strategic intelligence operation, not a tactical engagement. And it changes everything about how we respond. Marcus turned to face Voss. We can't approach this as a rescue mission. We have to approach it as a counterintelligence operation where the objective is denying the enemy information they're trying to acquire. Voss studied him with an expression that mixed calculation and concern. You're suggesting we prioritize destruction of our own aircraft over pilot recovery. I'm suggesting we create conditions where both are possible, but we accept that aircraft loss might be necessary to prevent technology transfer. The words tasted like betrayal, but Marcus had learned in Kandahar that sometimes tactical reality required choices that made ethics professors uncomfortable. How? By helping Rodriguez understand what she's facing so she can make informed decisions about how to fight. Right now, she's reacting to threats without knowing the larger picture. We change that. We change her options. Marcus switched back to guard frequency and keyed the microphone, knowing the transmission was probably being swallowed by jamming, but unable to accept silence as the only option. Wildcat flight, this is compass on guard. If you can hear this transmission, understand that you are being herded northeast toward a strategic objective. Electronic warfare is selective and intentional. Hostiles are attempting to force aircraft recovery in Valley 329er. Recommend terrain masking and aggressive maneuvering to prevent predictable flight paths. Compass will continue transmitting on guard frequency at 5-minute intervals. He released the key, and the static resumed. The communications officer was monitoring her equipment with intense focus, watching for any variance in the jamming pattern that might indicate the message had been received. Nothing. Marcus checked the chronometer on the tactical display. 47 minutes since the initial blackout. Rodriguez would be low on fuel if she'd been maneuvering aggressively. Her wingmen would be even lower, especially the less experienced pilots who always burned more gas when stress spiked their throttle hands. Time was becoming the enemy that no amount of tactical brilliance could defeat. "What's our fuel calculation for those aircraft?" Marcus asked. The analyst pulled up performance data. Assuming standard loadout and normal patrol consumption before the engagement, they would have approximately 53 minutes of fuel remaining at current time. Less if they've been in afterburner. 53 minutes. Marcus did the mental calculation automatically. In 53 minutes, 6 pilots would face the choice between ejection over hostile territory or attempting emergency landings with empty tanks. Either option gave the enemy exactly what they wanted. Pilots and technology delivered gift-wrapped into whatever facility waited in that valley. We need to give them another option. Marcus pulled up the terrain maps and started measuring distances and calculating flight times. How fast can we get tanker support to the edge of the jamming zone? Tanker is already airborne and holding at station 20 miles south of the demarcation line. But without communication, there's no way to coordinate refueling. There's always a way. Marcus zoomed in on the terrain south of the mountains. Here, open desert, flat terrain, good visibility. If Rodriguez breaks out of the mountains heading south, she'll pass over this area. We position the tanker in a racetrack pattern over this point, low altitude, visible from 30 miles. She'll understand what we're offering. You're betting she'll risk crossing back over the SAM barrier to reach a tanker she can't coordinate with. I'm betting she's smart enough to recognize that fuel is her most critical resource and that we're smart enough to position assets where she needs them. Marcus turned to Voss. Get that tanker moving. Low altitude, maximum visibility, continuous racetrack pattern over the coordinates I'm marking. And get me air superiority fighters positioned south of the demarcation line, ready to provide cover the moment our birds break free. Voss was already on the radio, her voice cutting through command channels with the authority of someone who'd learned to make bureaucracy move at combat speed. Asset coordination began flowing across the tactical display as aircraft repositioned and rescue packages moved to forward staging areas. Marcus watched it happen, while his mind stayed focused on the 6 blue diamonds that hadn't moved in 49 minutes. Rodriguez was out there somewhere, flying through contested airspace with 5 other pilots depending on her decisions, fighting a battle where the enemy controlled information and time was measured in fuel flow and engine flameouts. He trained her to think like this, to see beyond the immediate threat to the strategic picture, to understand that surviving combat wasn't about winning every engagement. It was about recognizing which battles to fight and which to avoid until conditions improved. The question was whether she'd remember those lessons when fear and fuel gauges were screaming contradictory advice. "Compass, this is JOC." The voice in his headset pulled Marcus back to the command tent. "We have authorization for rescue assets to cross the demarcation line. Ground teams are moving to forward positions now." "Copy JOC. Maintain rescue teams at ready status, but do not cross the line until we have positive location on downed aircraft. I don't want them exposed before we know where they're needed." The tactical situation was moving from paralysis to controlled chaos, which Marcus recognized as progress. Assets positioning, communication attempts continuing, rescue coordination building momentum. But none of it mattered if Rodriguez couldn't break free of whatever was waiting in those mountains. Marcus pulled up the infrared satellite feed again and stared at the terrain northeast of the engagement zone. The mountains showed up as cold, dark shapes against warmer desert, their valleys invisible to overhead surveillance. Somewhere in that darkness, 6 F-16s were fighting a battle that no one could see and no one could support. "Update satellite coverage," Marcus ordered. "I want maximum resolution on the valley where hostile activity has been concentrated. If there's anything down there, structures, vehicles, aircraft, I need to see it." The analyst worked the controls and the image zoomed in, but the valleys remained frustratingly dark. Satellite infrared couldn't penetrate terrain masking, and visual spectrum was useless in midnight darkness. They were trying to see through stone and shadow with tools designed for open warfare. "What about unmanned aerial surveillance?" Marcus asked. "Can we get a drone over the valley?" "Negative. Electronic warfare would kill the control link. We'd lose the asset immediately. Not if we program it for autonomous operation. Send it on a fixed flight path through the valley with imaging systems running continuously. We lose the feed, but the data gets stored internally, and we recover it when the drone exits the jamming zone." Voss looked skeptical. "That's asking a lot from autonomous navigation in mountainous terrain. It's asking less than what Rodriguez is doing right now with 6 aircraft and 0 support." Marcus met her eyes. "We need intelligence on what's in that valley. If they're setting up for forced recovery, there will be infrastructure. Lights, vehicles, something we can identify and warn Rodriguez about." Voss held his gaze for 5 seconds, then nodded. "I'll coordinate with UAV operations. ETA to launch is 20 minutes if we strip out unnecessary systems and load it with maximum imaging capability. Do it, and make sure the flight path takes it through the valley at low altitude. I want detail, not overview." The room's energy had shifted again. People were moving with the urgency of personnel who understood they were racing against fuel gauges and enemy intentions. Marcus returned to the guard frequency and keyed another transmission, knowing it was probably futile, but unable to accept that silence was his only contribution. "Wildcat flight, compass on guard. Tanker support is positioning at coordinates 379-214, low altitude, racetrack pattern. Good visibility from southern approach. Refueling available if you can break free of engagement zone. Rescue assets standing by south of demarcation line. Do not attempt emergency landing in Valley 329er. Hostile infrastructure present. Compass will maintain guard frequency monitoring." Static answered him, thick and hostile. 51 minutes since the blackout. Fuel becoming critical. Options narrowing with every second that passed. Then the static changed. Just for a moment, maybe 2 seconds, the harsh hiss modulated into something that might have been a carrier wave, might have been atmospheric interference, might have been a pilot somewhere in the darkness keying a microphone with desperate hope that someone was listening. The communications officer's head snapped up. "Compass, I have variance in the jamming pattern. Duration 2.3 seconds, frequency consistent with UHF transmission. Could it have been accidental? Unknown. But it originated from inside the engagement zone." Marcus felt something cold and focused settle into his chest. Someone had heard him. Someone in that darkness was acknowledging his transmission with the only tool they had available, brief breaks in radio silence that might slip through the selective jamming for a few seconds before getting crushed again. "Monitor all frequencies continuously. If you get another variance, I need to know immediately what frequency it occurred on and how long it lasted. We're going to build a communication protocol using the gaps in their jamming." The officer nodded and bent over her equipment while Marcus returned to the tactical display. If Rodriguez had heard his transmission, she was already adjusting her tactics, moving toward options instead of just away from threats, which meant she'd try to break south, toward the tanker and friendly airspace, which meant crossing back over the SAM barrier that had been designed to prevent exactly that maneuver. "I need projected SAM engagement zones updated for southern crossing attempts." The display refreshed and red circles appeared, overlapping in deadly patterns that covered every logical approach route. The SAMs were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that any aircraft attempting to cross would be exposed to multiple threats simultaneously. Classic Soviet doctrine, executed with precision that suggested professional military planning. "Those engagement zones assume the SAMs are still active," Marcus said quietly. "What if they're not?" Voss stepped closer. "The satellites show the sites are still emitting." "Emitting isn't shooting. They've already established the barrier. They've already herded our aircraft where they wanted them. Now they're maintaining the threat to keep our rescue assets from penetrating while they execute whatever endgame they've planned in that valley." Marcus pointed at the SAM positions. But if Rodriguez calls their bluff and drives straight through that barrier at high speed and low altitude, she might discover they're not willing to shoot down the very aircraft they've spent this much effort trying to capture intact. The room went quiet again. What Marcus was suggesting violated every doctrine about SAM evasion and threat response. You're asking Rodriguez to bet her life and 5 other lives on your assessment that the enemy won't shoot. Voss's voice was flat. I'm not asking her anything. I'm trying to give her information so she can make her own decision. Marcus switched back to guard frequency. Wildcat flight, compass on guard. Tactical assessment suggests SAM barrier may be for show rather than engagement. Enemy objective appears to be intact aircraft recovery, not destruction. Southern crossing at high speed, low altitude may achieve breakthrough with acceptable risk. Your decision. Compass will support whatever option you choose. He released the key and the static resumed. The words felt inadequate, like trying to describe color to someone who'd never seen light. But they were all he had, fragments of information transmitted into darkness with the hope that somewhere a pilot was hearing them and understanding the implications. The analyst was staring at him with an expression that mixed horror and fascination. If you're wrong about their intentions, you just told 6 pilots to fly into a kill box. If I'm right, I just gave them their best chance at getting home. Marcus kept his voice level. Command means making calls with incomplete information. It means accepting that sometimes you're wrong and people die because of it. I learned that lesson once already. I won't make the mistake of failing to decide just because decision carries risk. 54 minutes since the blackout. Fuel becoming critical. The chronometer was marking time in heartbeats now. Each second bringing 6 aircraft closer to the moment when physics would override tactics and empty tanks would force decisions no one wanted to make. Then the communications officer's voice cut through the tension. Compass, I have another variance. Duration 4.7 seconds, UHF frequency 243.0. Pattern suggests deliberate key timing. Marcus was at her station in 3 steps. Play it back. She adjusted controls and the recording played through speakers. Static, then a brief modulation that wasn't quite clear enough to be voice but wasn't quite random enough to be interference. 2 distinct pulses separated by a gap, then 3 more pulses in rapid succession. That's not atmospheric, Marcus said with certainty. That's intentional communication. 2 pulses, pause, 3 pulses. Could be acknowledgement, could be status report, could be he stopped. Looked at Voss. Felt understanding cascade through his mind like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across 14 months suddenly clicking into place. It's Morse code. She's transmitting in Morse code because it'll punch through the jamming better than voice, and it's simple enough to send by microphone key. Voss was already moving. Someone get me a Morse code translation reference, and get me every communications officer who knows Morse on this base right now. The tent erupted into controlled chaos. Personnel were running for reference materials, pulling specialists from other duties, setting up recording equipment to capture and analyze any future transmissions. Marcus stood at the tactical display and felt the first genuine hope since he'd climbed into the Black Hawk. Rodriguez had heard him, had understood, was using the oldest communication protocol in military aviation to punch through electronic warfare that cost millions to develop and deploy, fighting smart instead of hard. The communications officer was decoding the transmission, fingers moving over her keyboard while she referenced a Morse code chart that someone had pulled up on an adjacent screen. Compass, preliminary decode shows. 2 pulses followed by 3 pulses. In Morse that would be a answer. Letter A is dot dash, letter S is dot dot dot. Acknowledged and surviving, Marcus said it like revelation. She's telling us she received the transmission and her flight is still operational. He keyed the microphone immediately. Wildcat flight, compass copies your Morse transmission. Acknowledge with 2 pulses if you understand this response. 30 seconds of static. Then the variance returned. 2 distinct pulses, clear and deliberate. Marcus felt something in his chest unclench fractionally. They had communication. Limited, fragile, intermittent communication that depended on gaps in the jamming and Rodriguez's ability to key her microphone at exactly the right moments. But it was communication, which meant coordination was possible, which meant rescue shifted from desperate hope to tactical operation. "Get me fuel status options," Marcus ordered. "I need to know if they can reach the tanker, or if we need to move the tanker closer to the engagement zone." The analyst worked quickly. Based on time elapsed and probable fuel consumption, the flight should have approximately 47 minutes remaining. Tanker is currently positioned 80 miles south of their last known location. At cruise speed, they could reach the tanker with approximately 12 minutes of fuel remaining. But that assumes direct flight with no maneuvering and no afterburner use, which means they don't have enough if they encounter any resistance during the southern crossing. Marcus studied the tactical display with the focus that had earned him his call sign. "What if we move the tanker north, across the demarcation line?" Voss's voice carried warning. "Into contested airspace where it could be engaged by the same systems threatening our fighters." A tanker is civilian profile, large, slow, unarmed. Not a tactical target for someone trying to avoid international incident while conducting intelligence operations. Marcus pointed at the map. "Move it 20 miles north of the line, same racetrack pattern, maximum visibility. We cut their required flight time in half and give Rodriguez options if she takes battle damage during the crossing." Voss studied him for a long moment. The decision violated doctrine and risked an unarmed aircraft in hostile territory. But doctrine was written by people who'd never stood in a parking lot at midnight watching their normal life evaporate because a colonel needed the impossible. "I'll authorize the movement," Voss said finally. "But if we lose that tanker, this entire operation becomes a lot more complicated. If Rodriguez runs out of fuel, the operation is already over. This just changes who makes the hard choices." Voss pulled out her radio and started coordinating the tanker movement while Marcus returned to guard frequency. The Morse code transmission had proven that communication was possible, but it required precise timing and understanding on both ends. He needed to establish a protocol that Rodriguez could follow without lengthy explanation. Wildcat flight, compass on guard. Establishing communication protocol using Morse code via microphone key. Acknowledge orders with 2 pulses. Indicate negative with 3 pulses. Tanker moving to northern position, approximately 50 miles south of your current estimated location. Stand by for updated coordinates via Morse code." Marcus gestured to the communications officer. "I need you to transmit the tanker's coordinates in Morse code on guard frequency. Slow transmission, 5-second gaps between each number. Give her time to copy." The officer nodded and began the painstaking process of converting coordinates into dots and dashes, transmitting each character slowly enough that a pilot flying combat air patrol in hostile airspace might be able to copy them while managing 5 other aircraft and evading threats. It took 3 minutes to transmit the full coordinate string. Then silence while they waited to see if Rodriguez had received and understood. Marcus counted heartbeats and tried not to think about fuel gauges or SAM engagement zones, or the dozen ways this could still end badly. 2 pulses came through the static, clear and strong, acknowledged. "She copied the coordinates," the communications officer said with audible relief. "She's acknowledging the tanker position." Marcus allowed himself a tight smile. "Now we see if she's brave enough to punch through the SAM barrier." The next 5 minutes were the longest Marcus had experienced since Kandahar. The tactical display showed nothing useful, just the frozen blue diamonds and the SAM sights and the terrain features that hid everything important. Satellite updates came every 90 seconds but revealed only that nothing visible had changed. The tent had gone quiet except for the background hum of electronics and the occasional radio coordination as assets repositioned across the operational theater. Then the communications officer's voice cut through the silence. "Compass, I'm seeing multiple variance patterns across several frequencies. Duration is too long to be Morse code. This looks like active radar emissions. Multiple sources, all inside the engagement zone. They're lighting up. Marcus felt his pulse spike. Active radar meant aircraft were being tracked, which meant either the SAMs were preparing to engage or something else was happening that required precise targeting data. Get me the Sentry. I need immediate analysis of those radar emissions. The connection came through layered with static. Compass, Sentry 07, were tracking the emissions, multiple ground-based search radars going active simultaneously. Pattern suggests coordination for surface-to-air engagement, but acquisition radars are not showing lock-on behavior. What are they doing if they're not locking targets? Unknown. The radar emissions are sweeping standardized patterns, but they're not focusing on specific tracks. It's like they're advertising their presence. Marcus stared at the tactical display while understanding crystallized. They're creating a threat display, making sure Rodriguez knows exactly where all the SAMs are so she understands the risk of the southern crossing. They want her to know that attempting the barrier is possible but dangerous. Why would they give away their positions? Because they're still trying to herd her northeast. The threat of engagement is more useful than actual engagement if the objective is intact recovery. Marcus switched back to guard frequency. Wildcat flight, compass on guard, multiple SAM sites going active radar. Assessment suggests threat display rather than engagement preparation. Southern crossing remains viable. Recommend high-speed low-altitude transit, random jinking to defeat tracking solutions. Tanker standing by at transmitted coordinates. Execute at your discretion. He released the key and waited. This was the moment where command became faith, where all the tactical planning and asset coordination and communication protocol meant nothing if Rodriguez didn't trust the analysis enough to bet 6 lives on it. 58 minutes since the blackout, fuel approaching critical levels. Every second of hesitation cost options and increased the probability of catastrophic outcome. Come on, Rodriguez, Marcus thought. Remember the sandstorm. Remember what I taught you about fighting when nothing makes sense. Trust your training and move. The static hissed its endless commentary. Then the communications officer's voice, sharp with urgency. Compass, Sentry is reporting multiple high-speed tracks moving south from the mountain region. 6 aircraft in loose trail formation, altitude Angels 15 and descending. Speed is 450 knots and increasing. Marcus felt electricity course through his veins. She's making the run. All stations. Wildcat flight is executing southern crossing. Stand by for SAM engagement. The tactical display updated as the Sentry's radar data was processed and transmitted. 6 blue diamonds were no longer frozen in their last known position. They were moving, fast and low, driving straight toward the SAM barrier like missiles with human guidance systems. The diamonds descended as Marcus watched, dropping from 15,000 feet to 12,000 to 9,000 in smooth progression that spoke of coordinated flight and aggressive tactics. SAM sites are tracking, the analyst reported. Multiple acquisition radars have locked onto the formation. No launch indications yet, but they have firing solutions. Marcus's hands were gripping the edge of the tactical display with enough force to hurt. This was the moment when his analysis would be proven correct or catastrophically wrong. If the SAMs launched, 6 pilots would die because he'd convinced them to fly into a kill box. If they didn't launch, it would confirm that the entire engagement was about forcing intact recovery rather than destruction. The blue diamonds crossed the first SAM engagement ring at 5,000 feet and 470 knots. No launches. Crossed the second ring at 3,000 feet and accelerating. No launches. Drove through the heart of the overlapping engagement zones where doctrine said nothing should survive, and still the SAMs held their fire like weapons that had forgotten their purpose. She was right, Voss said quietly. They're not shooting. They're not shooting yet, Marcus corrected. Let's see if they maintain that discipline when Rodriguez clears the barrier and heads for the tanker. The blue diamonds emerged from the southern edge of the SAM envelope and began climbing immediately, gaining altitude now that the threat was behind them. 6 aircraft in loose formation, every pilot probably checking fuel gauges and calculating range to the tanker and running the mental mathematics of survival. Marcus keyed the microphone. Wildcat flight, compass on guard. Beautiful crossing. Tanker is 15 miles ahead at your current heading. Altitude Angels 20. Flying racetrack pattern north to south. You should have visual contact in approximately 4 minutes. Prepare for emergency refueling procedures. 2 pulses acknowledged. The tent erupted in subdued celebration. People were shaking hands and clapping backs and allowing themselves brief moments of relief. But Marcus stayed focused on the tactical display, watching the blue diamonds close with the tanker's track while his mind calculated fuel reserves and engagement timelines. They weren't home yet. Emergency refueling in darkness without radio coordination was dangerous even in peacetime. 6 aircraft would need to join on the tanker visually, match speed and altitude, then take turns plugging into the refueling boom using nothing but hand signals and professional skill. The least experienced pilot would go first while they still had fuel to maneuver. Then each successive aircraft in order of remaining gas until either everyone was refueled or someone ran out of options. How long for emergency refueling procedures? Marcus asked. The analyst pulled up reference data. Minimum time for 6 aircraft would be approximately 18 minutes if everything goes perfectly. More likely 25 to 30 minutes allowing for positioning delays and connection difficulties. Marcus did the mathematics automatically. 62 minutes since the blackout. Fuel should be approaching critical levels. Rodriguez would have maybe 15 minutes of reserve if she'd been flying efficiently, less for her wingmen. 18 minutes minimum for refueling meant at least 1 aircraft might run dry before getting gas. Get me rescue helicopters airborne immediately, Marcus ordered. Position them along the refueling track in case someone has to eject. Voss was already coordinating, her radio calls sharp and professional. Asset coordination flowed across multiple channels as rescue packages lifted off from forward bases and began racing north toward the refueling point. The tactical display updated continuously as more information became available. The 6 blue diamonds had merged with the tanker's track now, forming a loose gaggle that represented 6 pilots fighting fatigue and stress and empty tanks while trying to execute precision flying in midnight darkness. Marcus watched them maneuver, seeing the dance of aircraft jockeying for position, imagining the hand signals and visual cues that were substituting for the radio calls that would normally coordinate this ballet. The first aircraft separated from the gaggle and moved into refueling position behind the tanker. The tracks merged, held steady for 3 minutes, then separated as the first pilot topped off and moved away to let the next aircraft connect. 1 down, 5 to go. Time crawling past in seconds that felt like hours. The second aircraft moved into position, connected, started taking fuel. Then its track stuttered, separated from the tanker prematurely, rejoined briefly before separating again permanently. Problem with the second aircraft, the analyst said unnecessarily. Looks like they couldn't maintain stable position for full refueling. Marcus felt tension knot in his chest. Unstable refueling meant either pilot fatigue or aircraft damage or mechanical issues, any of which could cascade into emergency situations that required immediate response. Get me eyes on that refueling operation. I need to know what's happening. We don't have visual assets in position. Satellite coverage is insufficient for that level of detail. Then get me the tanker's crew on secure frequency. They can see what's happening even if we can't. The communications officer worked quickly, and Marcus found himself connected to the tanker's boom operator, a voice that carried the professional calm of someone who'd done this job under worse conditions. Compass, this is Texaco 27 boom operator. We have visual on 6 F-16s attempting emergency refueling. First aircraft completed successfully. Second aircraft is having stability issues. Pilot appears to be fighting aircraft control problems. Recommend they take minimum gas and move on to let others connect. Copy Texaco. How much fuel did number 2 receive? Approximately 1/3 of requested load. Enough to reach friendly airfield if they head straight there, but not enough for extended maneuvering. Marcus keyed the guard frequency. Wildcat 2, compass on guard. Understand you have control issues. Recommend you accept partial gas and proceed direct to nearest friendly field. Coordinates are. He rattled off the location of the closest airfield with crash response capability, transmitting in Morse code through the communications officer, while his mind tracked the developing situation. The third aircraft was connecting now, taking fuel in smooth professional fashion that suggested a pilot who'd done this enough times to make it look routine. The gaggle was spreading out as aircraft finished refueling and moved away from the tanker, creating space for the remaining birds to maneuver. 4 down, 2 to go. Then the radar tracks from the sentry showed new contacts. Multiple aircraft, moving fast from the north, closing on the refueling track at speeds that suggested hostile intent. Compass, Sentry 07. We have 4 contacts inbound from the north at high speed. Estimated time to intercept is 6 minutes. Profile is consistent with hostile fast movers. The celebration in the tent evaporated instantly. Marcus felt cold calculation replace relief. They'd escaped the SAM barrier, but the enemy wasn't willing to let them reach safety without one final attempt at forcing the situation. What assets do we have available for air superiority? Voss was already coordinating. 4 F-16s at combat air patrol south of the demarcation line. ETA to intercept is 8 minutes. They'll be too late. Marcus studied the tactical picture with the focus that had earned him his call sign. Rodriguez's flight is vulnerable during refueling. Can't maneuver effectively, can't defend themselves, and at least 2 aircraft probably don't have enough gas to run even if they wanted to. He keyed the guard frequency. Wildcat flight, compass on guard. 4 hostile fast movers inbound from north. ETA 6 minutes to your position. Recommend expedited refueling and prepare for defensive engagement. Friendly air superiority is 8 minutes out. You need to hold them for 2 minutes until support arrives. The response came in Morse code, transmitted quickly through breaks in the residual jamming. 4 pulses. Interrogative. Rodriguez was asking for clarification or options, or something Marcus couldn't decode without better communication. He tried again, speaking slowly and clearly despite the stress that wanted to make his voice urgent. Wildcat flight. Hostile aircraft are attempting to force engagement while you are vulnerable. 2 aircraft still need fuel. Recommend minimum gas for remaining birds and immediate departure from refueling track. Establish defensive perimeter and hold until friendly support arrives. Do not attempt to engage offensively. Defense only. 2 pulses acknowledged. Marcus watched the tactical display as the blue diamonds began moving with renewed purpose. The 5th aircraft was connecting to the tanker now, taking fuel in what looked like deliberately rapid fashion, getting enough to survive rather than enough to be comfortable. The 6th aircraft was holding in position, waiting its turn, while the 4 already refueled aircraft were spreading into defensive formation around the tanker. Rodriguez was setting up a screen, using her flight to protect the most vulnerable aircraft while they finished the refueling that would give them all a chance at survival. Hostile aircraft are 4 minutes out, the analyst reported. They're not deviating, this is a deliberate intercept. Marcus pulled up the air superiority coordination channel. Knife flight, compass on tactical. I need your ETA updated and your best speed to intercept. Wildcat flight is engaged in emergency refueling with hostile fast movers inbound. They need support immediately. The response came back tense and professional. Compass, knife flight lead. We're showing 6 minutes to intercept at maximum speed. We're pushing it but can't overcome the geometry. 6 minutes meant Wildcat flight would have to defend themselves for 4 minutes without support. 4 minutes where fuel-critical aircraft with limited weapons would face fresh hostiles who'd chosen the engagement timing deliberately. Rodriguez is going to have to fight, Voss said quietly. Marcus didn't answer. He was calculating weapons loads and fuel states, and the mathematics of air combat that always came down to energy and position and pilot skill. Rodriguez had skill. What she didn't have was the fuel reserves to sustain maneuvering combat, or the weapons load to engage multiple targets simultaneously, or the situational awareness that came from functional radar and data links. She had determination and training, and 5 other pilots who would follow her lead even when the smart choice was to run. The 6th aircraft was connecting to the tanker now, taking fuel with visible urgency as its track wobbled slightly in the refueling position. Hostile aircraft are 3 minutes out, the analyst's voice cut through Marcus's thoughts. Knife flight is 5 minutes out. The timeline is not working in our favor. Marcus keyed the guard frequency one more time. Wildcat flight, compass on guard. Hold what you have. Do not attempt heroic defense. Survival is victory. Make them work for every second while we bring support. Knife flight is inbound and will be there before you run out of options. He didn't know if that was true. Didn't know if Rodriguez had enough fuel to maneuver or enough weapons to pose credible threat or enough luck to survive the next 5 minutes. But command meant projecting confidence even when the tactical picture showed nothing but hard choices and worse alternatives. The 6 blue diamonds were fully formed now, defensive perimeter established around the tanker, while the last aircraft finished taking fuel. Good spacing, good positioning, exactly the kind of disciplined formation that Marcus had drilled into pre-deployment training years ago. Rodriguez had remembered, had taken lessons learned in peacetime and applied them in the chaos of combat when everything was falling apart. The last aircraft disconnected from the tanker and moved into position in the defensive screen. 6 blue diamonds now, all with enough fuel to survive, arrayed in a perimeter that would make hostile aircraft work for any engagement opportunity. Hostile aircraft are 2 minutes out, the analyst reported. Knife flight is 4 minutes out. We have a 2-minute gap where Wildcat flight will be unsupported. Marcus felt the weight of command settle onto his shoulders with familiar pressure, every decision cascading into consequences, every choice measured against the lives that hung in the balance. He'd made the call to move the tanker north, had told Rodriguez to punch through the SAM barrier, had coordinated the refueling that had put 6 aircraft in vulnerable position when hostile fast movers arrived. If this went wrong, it was on him. Again. Just like the training scenario that had ended his career, just like every other moment when he doubted himself and made the safe choice instead of the right one. Sophia's face flashed through his mind. Algebra homework and frozen dinners and the careful way she never asked about the past. He told himself that being a father meant choosing stability over the parts of himself that thrived in chaos. But watching 6 blue diamonds prepare to defend themselves against impossible odds while he stood uselessly in a command tent, Marcus understood that he'd been lying to himself for 14 months. Being a father meant teaching by example, meant showing his daughter that when people needed you, you showed up even when showing up was terrifying. That competence mattered more than comfort. That sometimes the right choice was the hard one, and you made it anyway because people were depending on you to not fail. Hostile aircraft are 90 seconds out. The analyst's voice had gone flat, professional distance from emotional weight. Wildcat flight has established defensive perimeter. Knife flight is 3 minutes 30 seconds out. Time to intercept is not favorable. Marcus opened the guard frequency and keyed the microphone with steady hands. Wildcat flight, compass on guard. 60 seconds to contact. Remember your training. Defend smart, not hard. Make them come to you. Knife flight is closing fast and will be there soon. Hold what you have and survive the next 3 minutes. That's your mission. Survive. 2 pulses acknowledged. Then the tactical display erupted into geometry as 8 aircraft merged into the same piece of sky and began the deadly calculus of air combat. Red diamonds mixed with blue diamonds on the screen, tracks overlapping and separating and weaving through 3-dimensional space in patterns that Marcus could read like sheet music. Rodriguez had taken her flight into a defensive spiral, using the tanker as the anchor point, while her 4 refueled aircraft established a rotating perimeter that forced hostile aircraft to commit to specific attack vectors. Classic defense against superior numbers. Make them choose their shots carefully, present multiple threats simultaneously, force them to split their attention between targets. The hostile aircraft were pressing hard, their tracks showing aggressive tactics that suggested pilots who knew they had limited time before friendly reinforcements arrived. They were trying to force quick kills, going for separation and isolation to break up the defensive formation. But Rodriguez wasn't letting them. Every time a hostile track committed to an attack run, two blue diamonds would countermaneuver to present threat from multiple angles. Never engaging directly, just forcing the hostile to choose between pressing the attack and defending against counter-threat. "She's fighting the clock," Marcus said to no one in particular, "making them waste time and energy while she waits for support to arrive." "It's working so far," Voss responded. "But fuel is still a factor. Even with refueling, aggressive maneuvering like that burns gas quickly." The tactical display showed a merge one red diamond and one blue diamond occupying the same space briefly before separating. "Wildcat has engaged," the analyst reported. "Looks like defensive missiles fired." Marcus held his breath while the tracks separated and reformed. The red diamond continued its aggressive turn, pursuing the blue diamond that had fired, but two other blue diamonds were converging from flanking positions, and the hostile was forced to break off before achieving firing position. "No kills," the analyst confirmed. "Missiles defeated. Wildcat flight is maintaining defensive perimeter." 2 minutes since the hostile aircraft had arrived. Rodriguez's flight was still intact, still maneuvering, still denying the hostile fast movers the easy kills they'd expected when they'd chosen to intercept during refueling operations. But Marcus could see the defensive perimeter starting to compress as fuel concerns forced less aggressive counter-maneuvers. The spiral was tightening, giving hostile aircraft better angles and more options. "Knife flight, compass on tactical. I need your updated ETA." The response came back with audible engine noise in the background. "Compass, knife lead, 2 minutes 30 seconds to intercept. We have visual on multiple radar contacts and are authorized weapons free on hostile aircraft." 2.5 minutes. Rodriguez needed to hold for 2.5 more minutes before friendly air superiority arrived and changed the entire engagement geometry. Marcus keyed the guard frequency. "Wildcat flight, compass on guard." "Knife flight is 2 minutes 30 seconds out. Maintain defensive posture. Do not pursue kills. Survival is victory." The tactical display showed another merge. Two red diamonds converging on a single blue diamond from opposing angles, classic pincer maneuver designed to force a target into choosing which threat to defend against. The blue diamond went into a hard defensive break, spoiling both attack angles, while two other blue diamonds converged to threaten the hostile aircraft from below. But this time, one of the red diamonds didn't break off. It pressed the attack despite the counter-threat, closing to firing range and launching missiles that appeared on the display as tiny hash marks streaking toward the blue diamond. "Missiles in the air," the analyst's voice was tight. "Hostile has launched on Wildcat. 2 missiles tracking." Marcus watched the blue diamond maneuver, saw it deploy countermeasures and break hard into the threat, doing everything doctrine said to do when missiles were inbound. The hash marks closed with the blue diamond, merged briefly, then separated. One missile broke track and flew ballistic. The other continued tracking through the defensive maneuvers, adjusting its flight path with the persistence of modern guidance systems that were designed to defeat exactly this kind of evasion. "Missile is still tracking," the analyst reported. "Wildcat is in defensive maneuvering." The blue diamond was pulling hard now, trading altitude for airspeed, trying to defeat the missile through energy management and countermeasures. But the hash mark stayed locked on, closing relentlessly across the tactical display. Then a second blue diamond appeared on the same vector, positioning itself between the first blue diamond and the pursuing missile. Marcus understood what he was seeing a half-second before it happened. "No," he said quietly. "Too late." The second blue diamond released flares in a massive dump, saturating the airspace with thermal signatures that were designed to seduce infrared seekers away from their targets. The hash mark deviated, tracking toward the second blue diamond, and Marcus watched aircraft and missile merge on the tactical display while his brain processed the tactical implications. Someone in Rodriguez's flight had just deliberately drawn a missile away from a wingman by placing their own aircraft in the threat envelope. Selfless defense. The kind of flying that required absolute trust and zero hesitation. The merge lasted 3 seconds. Then the hash mark disappeared and both blue diamonds emerged on the other side of the intercept point, still flying, still maneuvering, still in the fight. Missile defeated, the analyst said with audible relief. Both Wildcat aircraft are still operational, but the defensive spiral had collapsed during the engagement. The tight perimeter had blown out as aircraft maneuvered to defeat threats and defend wingmen, and now the 4 hostile aircraft had what they'd been trying to achieve: separation, isolation. Individual blue diamonds scattered across enough airspace that coordinated defense became difficult. The hostile aircraft pressed their advantage immediately, splitting into pairs and going after separated targets with renewed aggression. "Knife flight is 90 seconds out," Marcus said into the guard frequency, his voice carrying an urgency he couldn't suppress. "Wildcat, hold on. Support is almost there." The tactical display showed geometry that made Marcus's trained eye see disaster approaching. 2 red diamonds converging on 1 blue diamond from angles that were difficult to defend simultaneously. Another red diamond pursuing a blue diamond that was too far from mutual support to receive assistance. The hostile pilots knew they had less than 2 minutes before friendly air superiority arrived and changed everything. They were pressing for kills now, accepting risk and pushing their attacks with the aggression of pilots who understood their window was closing. Then Marcus saw it. 1 blue diamond, separate from the others, turning back toward the fight instead of away from it. Not defensive maneuvering, not evasive action. A deliberate turn toward hostile aircraft with the aggressive geometry of someone who decided that defense wasn't enough anymore. "Wildcat lead is going offensive," the analyst said, with a mix of surprise and concern. Rodriguez had stopped running, had seen her flight getting separated, and decided that the only way to prevent piecemeal destruction was to flip the script and make the hostile aircraft defend instead of attack. It was tactically aggressive and strategically sound, and exactly the kind of decision that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. The blue diamond that was Rodriguez's aircraft drove through the center of the engagement, forcing hostile aircraft to choose between maintaining their attacks or defending against a new threat from an unexpected quarter. 2 red diamonds broke off their pursuit and turned to engage Rodriguez's aircraft instead. And suddenly, the geometry shifted from hostile aircraft hunting separated targets to hostile aircraft dealing with a coordinated counterattack. Rodriguez's wingmen saw the opening and adjusted immediately. The separated blue diamonds reversed course and converged back toward the fight, reforming the defensive perimeter around the aggressive center that Rodriguez had created. Within 30 seconds, the tactical picture had shifted from Wildcat flight on the defensive to hostile aircraft trying to extricate themselves from a trap they hadn't seen coming. 60 seconds, Marcus transmitted. "Knife flight is 60 seconds out. Wildcat has the advantage. Press it." The hostile aircraft had lost their momentum, were reacting instead of attacking, were checking over their shoulders for the friendly air superiority that was about to arrive and change 4-on-6 odds into 4-on-10. Then 1 red diamond made a decision. Instead of continuing the engagement, it broke hard away from the fight and ran north at maximum speed. The other 3 hostile aircraft followed immediately, abandoning the engagement and racing back toward friendly airspace before knife flight arrived and turned the hunt into a rout. "Hostile aircraft are breaking contact," the analyst reported. "All 4 contacts running north at high speed. Knife flight is 30 seconds from intercept." The tactical display showed red diamonds fleeing north, while blue diamonds reformed into a disciplined formation, and knife flight's 4 fresh aircraft arrived at the engagement zone with weapons ready and no targets to engage. Marcus allowed himself a breath. Let tension drain from muscles that had been locked tight for minutes that felt like hours. 6 blue diamonds were intact, were maneuvering back into formation, were heading south toward friendly airspace and safety and debriefings that would take hours. All aircraft, compass on tactical. Wildcat flight, excellent work. Proceed direct to friendly airfield at best speed. Knife flight. Establish combat air patrol south of demarcation line and ensure hostile aircraft maintain separation. Tanker, you're cleared to return to base. Outstanding work by everyone. The tent erupted in celebration. People were cheering and clapping and allowing themselves the emotional release of personnel who just watched 6 lives hang in the balance and had seen all 6 survive against odds that should have been impossible. Voss was shaking his hand with grip that spoke of respect and relief and something that might have been vindication. "You did it," she said simply. "You brought them home." Marcus looked at the tactical display, at the 6 blue diamonds heading south in formation that was probably loose with fatigue but still professional, still disciplined. "Rodriguez brought them home," Marcus corrected. "I just gave her information. She made the hard calls when it mattered. You made the hard calls first. You told her to punch through the SAM barrier. You moved the tanker into contested airspace. You read the enemy's intentions and gave her the intelligence she needed to make informed decisions. That's command." Marcus felt the words settle into places that had been empty for 14 months. Command meant making decisions with incomplete information, meant accepting risk and trusting the people you trained to execute with competence even when conditions were terrible. It meant being willing to be wrong but refusing to fail to decide. He'd learned that lesson once in Kandahar, had forgotten it in a training scenario that ended his career, had relearned it tonight in a command tent in the desert while watching 6 blue diamonds fight their way home through conditions that should have been impossible. "I need to speak with Rodriguez," Marcus said. "When she lands, there are questions that need answers." "She'll be in debrief for hours," Voss warned. "Standard protocol for combat engagements." "Then I'll wait." Marcus looked at the colonel who'd arrived at midnight in a Black Hawk and asked him to remember who he used to be. "I need to know what she saw in those mountains, what we're dealing with, because whoever set up that electronic warfare trap and coordinated those SAM systems and sent 4 fast movers to intercept during refueling, they're planning something bigger than capturing 6 aircraft. This was a test, a probe to assess our capabilities and our responses, which means they'll try again, and next time they'll be better prepared." Voss studied him with an expression that carried calculation. "You're thinking long-term." "I'm thinking like someone who just got reminded that I'm better at this than I am at mopping floors." The Black Hawk flight back to the main airfield took 20 minutes. Marcus spent it staring out the crew compartment door at desert darkness, while his mind processed the tactical engagement and its implications. The electronic warfare system had been sophisticated. The SAM coordination had been professional. The hostile fast movers had pressed their attack with discipline and courage, even when facing numerical disadvantage. Someone had invested significant resources into creating a scenario designed to test American response and collect intelligence on capabilities, which meant someone was preparing for a larger conflict, and tonight had been reconnaissance for future operations. The airfield appeared ahead, lights marking runways and taxiways in geometric patterns. 6 F-16s were already on the ground, parked in a row near the operations building where ground crews were swarming over them with the urgent attention of personnel checking for battle damage. Marcus could see pilots climbing down from cockpits, moving with the stiff motions of people who'd been flying at high stress for over 90 minutes. The Black Hawk settled onto the ramp, and Marcus was out before the skids had fully touched down, moving toward the operations building with purpose that pulled ground personnel out of his path. Inside, he found Rodriguez immediately. She was standing at a debrief table surrounded by intelligence officers and flight surgeons, still wearing her flight suit, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who just fought air combat and survived through skill and luck in equal measure. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Marcus saw recognition flash through her fatigue. She'd known who Compass was the moment she'd heard the call sign on guard frequency, had understood that Marcus Hale was back, even if only temporarily, even if only for one night when impossible situations required desperate solutions. "Captain Rodriguez," Marcus said formally, "I need 5 minutes of your time before formal debrief begins." The intelligence officers looked ready to object, but Voss appeared behind Marcus with Colonel's authority that overrode procedural concerns. 5 minutes. Then she's all yours for however long debrief takes. Marcus guided Rodriguez away from the crowd, into a small briefing room that smelled like stale coffee and stress, and closed the door behind them. For a long moment they just looked at each other, pilot and instructor reunited by circumstances that neither had anticipated. "Sir," Rodriguez said finally. Her voice was hoarse from hours of breathing oxygen and shouting into a mask during high-G maneuvering. "I wasn't sure you'd come back, after everything." "I wasn't sure either," Marcus admitted. But Colonel Voss made a compelling argument about what happens when doctrine fails and someone needs to read the battle without instruments. "You saved us tonight." That transmission about the SAM barrier being a threat display rather than an engagement preparation. That's what let me make the call to punch through instead of staying trapped in the mountains. "You saved yourselves," Marcus corrected. "I just gave you information. You made the tactical decisions and flew the difficult maneuvering and kept 5 other pilots alive through conditions that would have killed most people." Rodriguez leaned against the briefing table with the careful posture of someone whose body was reminding them of every G they'd pulled in the past 2 hours. "What did you need to ask me?" Marcus pulled out the tablet that had been his constant companion in the Black Hawk and brought up the satellite imagery of the valley where Rodriguez's flight had been herded. "What did you see in the mountains? The satellites couldn't penetrate the terrain masking, but you were there. You flew through whatever they were trying to push you into. I need to know what you saw so we can understand what we're facing." Rodriguez's expression shifted, going from fatigue to something that looked like concern. "I saw infrastructure. Temporary structures that were definitely military in nature. Vehicle revetments, communication arrays, what looked like mobile radar systems, all positioned in a valley that provided natural concealment from overhead surveillance. How many vehicles? Maybe 30, maybe more. Hard to get accurate count when you're flying fast and low trying not to become a statistic, but it was a significant deployment. Too large to be a training exercise. Too well concealed to be anything other than deliberate positioning for operations." Marcus absorbed that while his mind built the strategic picture. 30 vehicles meant battalion-level deployment, meant command structure and logistics, and the kind of resources that required planning and authorization at high levels. "Did you see any aircraft?" "Negative. Just ground infrastructure and personnel movement. But the valley was large enough to serve as an expeditionary airfield if they wanted to deploy aircraft there." Marcus pulled up the terrain map and had Rodriguez mark the exact valley she'd seen. The location was deep in contested territory, positioned where it could support operations against multiple strategic targets, close enough to the demarcation line to enable rapid strikes but far enough back to provide warning time against American response. "They're building a forward operating base," Marcus said quietly, "using the mountains for concealment while they position assets for something. Air superiority operations, ground support, strategic strikes, maybe all of the above. If that's true, then tonight was a test," Marcus finished. "Testing our response time, our electronic warfare countermeasures, our willingness to cross the demarcation line for recovery operations. They gathered intelligence about how we fight when communications fail and doctrine stops working, which means next time they'll be ready for our response and we'll have countermeasures prepared." Rodriguez pushed away from the table, straightening despite visible exhaustion. "What do we do about it?" "I don't know yet. I'm a janitor who got recalled for one night because Colonel Voss needed someone crazy enough to make calls without complete information." Marcus closed the tablet and looked at Rodriguez with an expression that carried more weight than his words. "But I know that you and your flight flew brilliantly tonight. Aggressive when you needed to be, defensive when appropriate, and smart enough to recognize when the tactical situation required changing the engagement rules. Your wingman who drew that missile away from you during the intercept that was Captain Zhao." "Lieutenant Patel," Rodriguez corrected. "Zhao was flying my wing. Patel was number 5 and saw Kessler getting tracked by a missile that wasn't going to miss. put herself in the threat envelope and dumped flares like she was trying to light up the whole sky. Missile tracked her instead of Kessler, and we both made it home because she was willing to risk everything for a wingman. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. That was the kind of flying that created legends, the kind of selfless courage that military psychologists studied and commanders tried to cultivate and most pilots only heard about in stories. Make sure that gets into the debrief report. Make sure everyone knows what she did. Already planning on it, sir. Rodriguez moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. Are you staying? Officially, I mean. Coming back to operational flying. Marcus thought about Sophia and frozen dinners, and the storage unit where his metals gathered dust. Thought about the past 14 months spent convincing himself that normal life was worth more than this. Then he thought about tonight, about 6 blue diamonds fighting their way home while he coordinated from a command tent, about the satisfaction that came from making hard calls and seeing them work out correctly, about the piece of himself that had been missing since he'd walked away from flying. I don't know, he said honestly. Tonight I got recalled because someone needed expertise in reading air combat when technology fails. But that doesn't mean the Air Force wants me back permanently. Doesn't mean I want to come back to the life that ended my career once already. For what it's worth, sir, Rodriguez said quietly, I flew better tonight knowing you were on guard frequency. Knowing that someone who taught me how to think about air combat was watching and would tell me if I was making mistakes. That voice in the darkness made the difference between panic and focus. Marcus didn't trust himself to respond. Just nodded and watched Rodriguez leave to face the intelligence officers who would spend hours extracting every detail of the engagement, while analysts built reports and commanders made decisions about what to do with the information. He stood alone in the small briefing room and felt the weight of the past 14 months pressing against the reality of the past 3 hours. The door opened and Voss entered, holding 2 cups of coffee that smelled better than they probably tasted. She handed one to Marcus and leaned against the wall with the casual posture of someone who'd been in enough post-mission debriefs to know that the aftermath was sometimes harder than the actual combat. Rodriguez told me what she saw, Voss said. Battalion-level deployment in a concealed valley, forward operating base with infrastructure to support extended operations. All positioned exactly where they could threaten multiple strategic targets while remaining hidden from our surveillance. Which means tonight was reconnaissance, Marcus confirmed. They were testing us, learning how we respond when they create conditions that nullify our technological advantages. And they learned that when we have someone like you reading the battle, we can adapt faster than they expected. Rodriguez's flight survived because you gave her information that let her make informed decisions rather than just reacting to threats. Marcus sipped the coffee and grimaced at the taste. Rodriguez's flight survived because Rodriguez is an exceptional pilot who leads by example and has trained her people to think instead of just follow procedures. I was just the voice in the darkness telling her things she probably already knew. Don't diminish what you did tonight. Voss's voice carried an edge. You made calls that most commanders wouldn't have had the courage to make, moving the tanker into contested airspace, telling Rodriguez to punch through the SAM barrier, trusting that the enemy's objective was capture rather than destruction. Any one of those decisions could have been wrong and would have resulted in catastrophic losses. But they weren't wrong, because you trusted your instincts and read the tactical situation correctly. That's what command means. That's what we need. Marcus looked at her directly. What are you asking me, Colonel? I'm asking if you'd consider coming back, officially, not as a janitor who got recalled for one night, as a rated pilot with mission commander authority and responsibility for training the next generation of fighters to operate when technology fails. The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Marcus thought about Sophia and tried to imagine explaining to his 12-year-old daughter why her father was leaving again, why he was choosing combat missions over algebra homework, why duty mattered more than stability. Then he thought about Rodriguez and 5 other pilots who'd survived tonight because someone had been willing to make hard calls without complete information. Thought about the forward operating base hidden in the mountains and the larger conflict it represented. Thought about what happened when good people chose comfort over competence and let expertise atrophy because civilian life was easier than remembering how to fight. I have a daughter, Marcus said quietly. She deserves a father who's present and stable and not deployed to combat zones or spending 18-hour days in training operations. She deserves a father who shows her what it means to use your gifts when people need them, Voss countered, who demonstrates through action that competence matters and expertise is worth maintaining even when it's difficult. You can teach her those lessons from a civilian job, or you can teach her by example that when people need you, you show up. Marcus felt the truth of it settle into his chest like a key finding its lock. He'd been teaching Sophia lessons for 14 months. Lessons about safety and compromise and choosing the path of least resistance. But tonight he'd remembered different lessons. Lessons about courage and competence and the satisfaction that came from doing difficult things well. Maybe it was time for his daughter to learn that version of her father existed too. I'll need guarantees, Marcus said slowly, about assignment stability and deployment frequency. I won't abandon my daughter to chase adrenaline or prove something about myself. But if there's a way to balance being a father with being useful when situations require expertise that most people don't have, we'll work it out, Voss said immediately. Reserve status with mission commander authority, training responsibilities with regular people instead of constant deployments. You maintain your rating and keep your skills current, but you're not constantly in combat zones away from your family. When situations arise that need your specific expertise, we call. Otherwise, you live your life and raise your daughter. Marcus considered that. It wasn't perfect. Would still mean late nights and weekend training and occasional situations like tonight when normal life got interrupted by Black Hawks landing in parking lots. But it was honest work that used skills he'd spent years developing. Was better than mopping floors and pretending that expertise didn't matter. All right, Marcus said finally. I'll come back, but on one condition. Name it. Rodriguez gets promoted and receives recognition for tonight. Her entire flight gets whatever commendations are appropriate for fighting their way out of a trap that should have killed them all. And Patel gets special recognition for the missile defense that saved Kessler's life. They did the hard work. They deserve the credit. Voss smiled tightly. Already in process. I wrote the initial citations during the flight back. Rodriguez is getting a Distinguished Flying Cross. Patel is getting an Air Medal with Valor device. The rest of the flight is getting appropriate recognition for combat operations under extreme conditions. Good. Marcus finished the terrible coffee and set the cup down on the briefing table. Now I need to go call my daughter and explain why I'm not going to be home in time to make her breakfast. And then I need to figure out how to tell her that her father who cleans floors is actually going back to flying fighters. Tell her the truth, Voss suggested. That sometimes life gives you chances to be useful in ways you didn't expect. That competence matters and expertise is worth maintaining. That when people need you, showing up is what good men do. Marcus nodded slowly. That was exactly the truth. The question was whether a 12-year-old would understand it or just see her father choosing combat over comfort again. Either way, he'd made the decision. Had climbed into the Black Hawk and coordinated the mission, and given Rodriguez the information she needed to bring her flight home. Had remembered what it felt like to be Compass instead of just Marcus Hale, contractor. The next morning found Marcus standing outside his daughter's school, wearing the leather jacket with faded wings and waiting for Sophia to emerge from the building where she'd spent the day learning algebra and history and probably worrying about why her father hadn't been home that morning. When she finally appeared, backpack slung over one shoulder and phone in hand, she saw him immediately. Her expression cycled through surprise and confusion and something that might have been concern. Dad, what are you doing here? And why are you wearing that jacket? You never wear that jacket. Marcus gestured toward his truck in the parking lot. Come on, we need to talk. They drove in silence for 5 minutes before Sophia finally broke. Am I in trouble? Did something happen with school? Because Mrs. Peterson said my grades were fine and you're not in trouble, Marcus interrupted gently. I just need to tell you something important, and I wanted to do it somewhere other than the kitchen table, where we usually have difficult conversations. He pulled into a small park, and they sat on a bench that overlooked a playground where younger kids were screaming through afternoon chaos. Marcus tried to find words that would make sense to a 12-year-old who'd spent 14 months watching her father come home smelling like industrial cleaner. "Last night I got recalled to work for the Air Force," Marcus said simply. "Temporarily at first, but now permanently. I'm going back to flying fighters." Sophia stared at him with an expression that was difficult to read. "But you clean floors. You're a janitor. You said flying was in the past and we were focusing on normal life." I lied to both of us about what normal meant. Marcus looked at his daughter and saw intelligence and skepticism, and the careful emotional distance of someone who'd learned not to invest too much hope in unstable situations. "I spent 14 months convincing myself that being a good father meant choosing safety over everything else. But last night 6 pilots were trapped in hostile airspace, and someone needed to coordinate their rescue. Someone who understood how to read air combat when all the technology failed. And I realized that I'd been hiding from being useful because being useful was scary." "So you're leaving again?" Sophia's voice was flat. "Deploying and being gone for months while I stay with Aunt Sarah and eat frozen dinners alone. No, I'm taking a position that keeps me mostly here, training other pilots and maintaining my skills. When situations come up that need my specific expertise, I'll get called in. But I'm not deploying to combat zones constantly. I'm not choosing Air Force over family. I'm just refusing to pretend that my skills don't matter when people need them." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, watching the younger kids play with the focused attention of someone buying time to process unexpected information. "Are you going to be better at being my dad if you're flying fighters again?" she finally asked. Marcus felt the question land in his chest like a physical thing. "I don't know, but I know I've been terrible at it for the past 14 months because I was trying to be someone I'm not. Pretending that normal jobs and stable schedules were enough when part of me was dying every day. Maybe if I'm doing work that actually uses what I'm good at, I'll have more to give you instead of just exhaustion and frozen dinners." "You could have talked to me," Sophia said quietly. "Instead of just deciding that I needed you to be someone safe and boring. I'm 12, not 6. I can handle knowing that my dad does difficult things." Marcus felt shame wash through him. She was right. He'd been protecting her from information she didn't need protection from. Had been making decisions about what kind of father she needed without asking her what she actually wanted. "You're right. I should have talked to you. Should have been honest about struggling to figure out who I was supposed to be after leaving the Air Force. I'm sorry." Sophia leaned against him with the casual physicality of someone who still remembered being small enough to fit under her father's arm. "So what happens now?" "Now I start working at the base again. Training flights and mission coordination, and occasionally getting called when situations require someone with my specific experience. I'll be home most nights. Will still help with algebra homework and make dinners that are slightly better than frozen spaghetti. But I'll also be doing work that matters instead of work that just pays bills." "Will you tell me about it? The real work, not just the sanitized version you think I can handle." Marcus thought about Rodriguez and 6 blue diamonds fighting their way home through conditions that should have been impossible. Thought about the responsibility that came with command and the weight of making decisions when people's lives hung in the balance. "I'll tell you what I can. Some things are classified, and some things are too complicated to explain easily. But I'll try to be honest about what I do and why it matters. Deal?" "Deal." Sophia sat up and looked at him directly. "But you have to promise that if you're going to leave for something dangerous, you tell me beforehand. No more waking up to find you gone and Aunt Sarah making excuses." "I promise." Marcus pulled his daughter close and felt something that had been broken for 14 months start to heal. "Now let's go home. I'm going to make actual dinner that involves vegetables and protein, and you can tell me about whatever is happening at school that I've been too exhausted to ask about properly." They drove home together, father and daughter. rebuilding the relationship that Marcus had nearly destroyed by choosing safety over honesty. The house smelled stale when they entered, accumulated evidence of too many frozen dinners and too little attention to anything beyond survival. Marcus started dinner while Sophia did homework at the kitchen table, and they fell into a rhythm that felt more natural than anything had in months. Later that night, after Sophia had gone to bed, Marcus stood in the garage and opened the storage unit where his medals and flight gear had been gathering dust. The silver star caught light from the overhead bulb, commemorating missions in Kandahar that felt like they'd happened to someone else. The call sign patch compass was faded but intact, still carrying the weight of pilots who'd followed his voice through a sandstorm when everything else had failed. Marcus pulled the jacket on properly, feeling the leather settle onto his shoulders with familiar weight. Tomorrow, he'd report to the base, would start the process of returning to flight status and accepting the mission commander authority that Voss had offered, would begin teaching the next generation of pilots how to fight when technology failed and doctrine stopped working. Tonight, he was just a father who'd figured out that being useful mattered more than being safe. That competence was worth maintaining even when it was difficult, that when people needed you, showing up was what good men did. The jacket fit perfectly, like it had never really come off, like 14 months had been a brief interruption rather than the end of something important. Marcus turned off the garage light and went back inside, ready to face whatever came next with the confidence of someone who'd remembered who he was supposed to be. Compass. The pilot who could find direction when everything pointed wrong. The instructor who'd taught Rodriguez how to think instead of just follow procedures. The father who was going to teach his daughter that expertise mattered, and that sometimes the hard choice was the right one even when it was terrifying. Outside, the desert night was quiet except for distant sounds of aircraft launching from the base. F-16s climbing into darkness, their engines screaming defiance at gravity, flown by pilots who trained hard and now defended something larger than themselves. Somewhere among them, Rodriguez was probably flying night training, practicing the skills that had saved her life, and 5 others just hours ago. Marcus smiled and closed the door. Tomorrow he'd join them. Tonight he'd sleep in his own bed for the first time in 14 months without dreaming about mop buckets and failure.